Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Horizon, watching the stars through the main screen, when the message came through the long-range communications array and changed everything he thought he knew about humanity's place in the galaxy. The transmission bore the official seal of the Galactic Mediation Council, which meant it was important beyond anything Jake had ever received in his 20 years of diplomatic service, across human space and beyond into the territories of the alien species that had become humanity's neighbors and sometimes friends. Dr. Lisa Park, his chief science officer and closest friend, brought the decoded message to him personally, rather than sending it through the normal channels, which told Jake immediately that whatever this was about, it was serious enough to require his full attention. Lisa had worked with Jake for 8 years, and she never broke protocol, unless something truly extraordinary was happening. Her face showed both excitement and concern as she handed him the data pad, containing the full text of the message from beings so ancient and wise that most species considered them nearly godlike in their ability to solve conflicts between different worlds and civilizations. The message was simple and direct in a way that surprised Jake, because most communications from the advanced alien species tended to be filled with formal language and complex diplomatic protocols that could take hours to decode properly. The Galactic Mediation Council had tried everything they could think of to end a war that had been raging for over 1,000 years between two powerful alien empires, and now they were asking humanity for help, even though humans had only been traveling between the stars for less than 50 years and were considered newcomers by every other species in this part of the galaxy. The war was between the Zephyrian Empire and the Cronan Federation, and it had started over 1,000 years ago when both species were expanding into the same region of space, and neither one wanted to give up the valuable mining worlds they had found there. What began as a simple territorial dispute had grown into something much worse over the centuries, with both sides fighting battles that destroyed entire planets and killed billions of beings, while spreading hatred and violence across dozens of star systems that had once been peaceful and prosperous. Jake read through the background information that Lisa had compiled about the conflict and realized that this was unlike anything humans had ever been asked to help with before. Every major civilization in the galaxy had tried to bring peace between the Zephyrians and Cronans over the years, including species that were thousands of years older than humanity, and had solved conflicts that seemed impossible to outsiders. The wise Altarians had spent decades studying both cultures and failed to find common ground. The logical Vexans had created mathematical models that proved peace would benefit both empires, but neither side would accept their conclusions. Even the empathic Mindari, who could sense the emotions and thoughts of other species, had given up after years of trying to understand why the hatred ran so deep. Jake called his senior staff to the conference room to discuss this unexpected opportunity and challenge. Dr. Marcus Lee, his chief cultural specialist, had studied alien civilizations for most of his career and knew more about non-human psychology than almost anyone in the diplomatic corps. Colonel Amy Watson brought military experience from the early days, when humanity first encountered hostile alien species and had to learn how to fight and negotiate at the same time. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Scott managed all communications with alien species and had developed new translation protocols that helped humans understand the subtle meanings behind different alien languages and customs. The meeting lasted for hours as they discussed what they knew about the Zephyrians and Cronans and why so many attempts at peace had failed over the centuries. The Zephyrians were described as a proud reptilian species that valued honor and tradition above almost everything else, while the Cronans were insectoid beings who lived in collective groups and made decisions based on what was best for their entire civilization rather than individual desires. Both species were ancient and powerful, with technology that was far more advanced than anything humanity possessed and military forces that could destroy human colonies without much effort. Jake knew that accepting this assignment would be dangerous for his crew and his ship, but he also understood that this was exactly the kind of challenge that humanity had been preparing for since they first left Earth and began exploring the galaxy. Humans had always been good at finding solutions to problems that seemed impossible to others. And maybe their different way of thinking about conflicts and relationships could help. Where other species had failed, he made his decision and sent a reply to the Galactic Mediation Council accepting their invitation to attempt what no one else had been able to accomplish in 1,000 years of trying. The neutral meeting station hung in space like a metal flower between the territories of the two warring empires, and Jake could see the massive weapons platforms that both sides had built to guard their borders from attacks that had been happening for so long that neither species remembered what peace felt like. The station itself was ancient and had been used for diplomatic meetings for over 500 years. But none of those previous negotiations had succeeded in ending the violence that consumed entire generations of both the Zephyrians and the Cronins. Jake's first meeting with High Commander Velter Osix of the Zephyrian Empire took place in a room designed to accommodate different alien species with adjustable gravity and atmosphere controls that could make any being feel comfortable. During negotiations, Osix was nearly 8 feet tall with dark green scales that seemed to shift color, depending on his mood, and bright yellow eyes that showed intelligence and something else that Jake recognized as deep weariness from fighting a war that had lasted longer than human civilization had existed on Earth. The Zephyrian commander spoke in a voice that reminded Jake of distant thunder and explained that his people had been defending their honor and their territory for so many centuries that war had become their natural state of existence. Osix told Jake about battles fought on worlds that no longer existed because the fighting had been so intense that entire planets had been destroyed, leaving nothing but debris fields where millions of beings had once lived and worked and raised families that would never see peace. Supreme Marshal Keth Drammer of the Cronin Federation was completely different from the Zephyrian commander, but equally impressive in his own way. The Cronin was smaller than Osix, but his chitinous exoskeleton gleamed like polished metal, and his compound eyes seemed to see everything in the room at once, while his forearms moved in patterns that Jake learned were part of how Cronins communicated with each other through gestures that carried meaning beyond simple words. Drammer explained that the Cronins did not fight for individual glory like the Zephyrians, but for the survival of their entire civilization, which included not just the living members of their species, but also the memory of all those who had died in the long war. The Cronin collective consciousness meant that every death was felt by every member of their society, and the pain of losing so many of their people over the centuries had created a wound that might never heal even if the fighting stopped tomorrow. Jake spent days listening to both commanders explain their positions and their history while Dr. Park analyzed everything they said, looking for patterns that previous mediators might have missed. What she discovered was both surprising and troubling, because it suggested that this conflict was different from the simple territorial disputes that other species had assumed it to be. The war had started over mining rights and border territories, but it had become something much deeper and more complex over the 1,000 years it had been raging. During informal conversations with younger officers from both sides, Jake began to understand something that the previous mediators had not realized, because they had focused on the original causes of the war rather than how it had changed over time. Junior Zephyrian officer Kasta Hinnix spoke about her grandfather, who had fought in battles 300 years ago, and how his stories of courage and sacrifice had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be a Zephyrian warrior. Cronin engineer Thix Bellman described the hive memories that connected all members of his species to the experiences of their ancestors, including the pain and anger of those who had died fighting the Zephyrians over the centuries. For the Cronins, the war was not just about territory or resources, but about honoring the sacrifice of every member of their species who had given their lives to protect their civilization from what they saw as Zephyrian aggression. Dr. Park's analysis revealed something that explained why every previous attempt at peace had failed. Despite the best efforts of species that were far older and supposedly wiser than humanity, both the Zephyrians and the Cronins had lifespans that were much longer than humans could easily understand, with individual Zephyrians living for 800 years or more, while the Cronins existed as part of a collective consciousness that preserved memories and experiences across thousands of years without losing any details. or emotional intensity. This meant that for both species the war was not ancient history that could be forgotten or forgiven, but a living reality that felt as immediate and painful as if the first battles had been fought yesterday. Unlike humans, who might forget old conflicts within a few generations, or find ways to move past historical grievances, these alien species carried their hatred and anger with perfect clarity across centuries of fighting that had killed more beings than Jake could easily comprehend. Jake realized that he was not just trying to end a territorial dispute or negotiate a treaty between two governments, but attempting to heal psychological and cultural wounds that had been growing deeper and more infected for 1,000 years. The Zephyrians and Cronins were not fighting over the original border worlds anymore, but over the memory of every friend and family member and comrade who had died in the long war. And neither side could accept peace without feeling that they were betraying everyone they had lost. Jake decided to take an approach that confused and frustrated both alien delegations, because instead of discussing territory and trade agreements and military positions, like every previous mediator had done, he asked them to explain something that seemed completely unrelated to ending their war. He wanted to understand how each species thought about justice and honor, and what those concepts meant to beings who had been fighting for longer than human civilization had existed. High Commander Osix spoke for hours about the Zephyrian concept of ancestral duty and how every member of his species carried the responsibility to avenge wrongs that had been done to their people, even if those wrongs had happened centuries before they were born. The Zephyrian commander explained that honor was not just about individual actions, but about maintaining the reputation and dignity of their entire civilization across generations of warriors who had sacrificed everything to defend their way of life from enemies who wanted to destroy them. For the Zephyrians, surrender or compromise was not just military defeat, but a betrayal of every ancestor who had died fighting for their people, and every descendant who would inherit the shame of giving up the fight that had defined their civilization for so long. Osix told Jake that even if peace would benefit his people economically or politically, he could not accept it without dishonoring the memory of millions of Zephyrians who had given their lives believing that their sacrifice would lead to eventual victory over the Cronins. Supreme Marshal Drammer described a completely different but equally powerful set of beliefs that made peace seem impossible for his people to accept. The Cronin collective consciousness meant that the death of any individual was experienced by their entire civilization as a personal loss that could never be forgotten or forgiven. The Marshal explained that their hive mind preserved not just the memories of those who had died, but also their final emotions, including pain and fear and anger, that remained as vivid and immediate as if the deaths had happened moments ago rather than decades or centuries in the past. The Cronins fought not for individual glory or honor like the Zephyrians, but for the survival and integrity of their collective identity, which included every member of their species who had ever lived. Drammer told Jake that accepting peace would mean abandoning their fallen comrades to meaningless death and breaking the spiritual connection that held their civilization together across time and space. Jake listened to both explanations and began to understand why species that were supposedly wiser and more experienced than humanity had failed to find a solution to this conflict. The other mediators had treated the war as a political or economic problem that could be solved with the right combination of territorial concessions and trade agreements, but they had not understood that for both the Zephyrians and Cronins, the fighting had become central to their identity as civilizations. Colonel Watson presented detailed studies of human conflicts that had seemed equally impossible to resolve, including wars between European nations that had fought each other for centuries before eventually becoming close allies and partners. She explained how Germany and France had been bitter enemies for generations, but had found ways to work together and build lasting peace after understanding that continued fighting would destroy both of their societies. Dr. Lee analyzed the cultural barriers that prevented the Zephyrians and Cronins from accepting peace and compared them to similar situations in human history where ancient grievances had been overcome through patient work and gradual changes in how people thought about their enemies. He explained that humans had developed techniques for transforming hatred into cooperation over relatively short periods of time, but acknowledged that the alien species faced challenges that were much more difficult because of their long lifespans and perfect memories. Jake shared stories from human history that demonstrated his species' unusual capacity for forgiveness and reinvention, including examples of former enemies who had become friends and allies within a single generation. He explained how human societies could completely change their values and priorities when they realized that old ways of thinking were no longer helping them survive and prosper in a changing galaxy. The alien delegates listened to Jake's examples with skepticism and sometimes open disbelief, because the human approach to conflict resolution seemed naive and simplistic to beings who had been fighting for longer than humans had been capable of space travel. Both Osix and Drammer pointed out that humanity had only been exploring the galaxy for a few decades, while their war had been raging since before human ancestors had developed agriculture and written language. Jake realized that his species' greatest weakness in the eyes of these ancient civilizations might actually be their strength. In this particular situation, humans lived short lives and often forgot old grievances within a few generations, which other species saw as proof that humanity lacked the wisdom and commitment that came with long experience. However, Jake began to understand that this same characteristic might give humans a unique perspective on how to break cycles of violence that had trapped other species for centuries. He started to develop an idea that was so unusual and potentially controversial that he knew both delegations would probably reject it immediately, but he also believed it might be the only way to end a war that had become more about identity and memory than about the original disputes that had started the fighting so long ago. Jake's proposal was unlike anything that had ever been suggested in the 1,000 years of failed peace negotiations, and both alien delegations stared at him in silence for several minutes after he finished explaining his ideas, because what he was asking them to consider challenged everything they thought they knew about how conflicts between civilizations should be resolved. Instead of trying to fix a millennium of hatred and violence immediately, Jake wanted to create a plan that would take several generations to complete and would require both species to fundamentally change how they thought about their enemies and their own identities. The human diplomat explained that his species had learned something important about ending long conflicts that other civilizations might not understand because of their different lifespans and ways of thinking about time and change. Jake told the delegates that trying to resolve 1,000 years of accumulated trauma and anger in a single negotiation was impossible, but that gradual transformation over many decades might succeed where immediate solutions had failed. His plan involved 3 distinct phases that would be spread across 100 years of careful implementation, with each phase building on the success of the previous one. Phase 1 would establish limited ceasefires in specific border regions, where both empires had exhausted their resources fighting over planets that had been so damaged by warfare that they were no longer worth the cost of continued battles. These ceasefire zones would allow humanitarian aid to reach civilian populations that had been trapped in war zones for decades, and would create opportunities for prisoner exchanges that could help both sides recover military personnel who had been captured during recent fighting. Jake explained that these small steps would not end the war immediately, but would begin to establish patterns of cooperation that had not existed for centuries. Phase 2 would require both empires to work together on practical projects that would benefit their people without requiring them to abandon their core beliefs about honor and collective identity. Jake proposed the creation of joint colonies on uninhabited worlds where Zephyrians and Cronins would be forced to cooperate in order to survive and prosper in challenging environments that would require the best efforts of both species. The third phase of Jake's plan was the most ambitious and controversial part of his proposal because it involved cultural exchange programs and eventually intermarriage between members of the two species that had been trying to destroy each other for longer than most civilizations had existed. Jake acknowledged that this would take many generations to achieve, but argued that creating personal relationships and shared experiences between former enemies, was the only way to break the cycle of hatred that had trapped both civilizations in endless warfare. The key innovation in Jake's approach was something he called the memory protocol, which would allow both species to acknowledge the pain and loss they had suffered during the long war without requiring them to accept blame for starting the conflict or to forget the sacrifices their people had made over the centuries. This protocol would help the Zephyrians and Cronins honor their dead, while gradually transitioning from identities based on warfare and revenge to new ways of thinking about themselves that emphasized growth and cooperation rather than destruction and domination. High Commander Osix was the first to respond, and his reaction was exactly what Jake had expected from a being whose entire culture was built around honor and military tradition. The Zephyrian commander declared that Jake's proposal was not only impossible but insulting to every member of his species who had died fighting the Cronins over the past 1,000 years. Osix demanded to know how humans could be so naive as to think that a conflict of this magnitude and duration could be resolved through gradual change and cultural exchanges. Supreme Marshal Drammer's response was more measured but equally negative, because the Cronin collective consciousness made it impossible for his species to simply forget or ignore the memories of their fallen comrades. The Marshal explained that asking his people to work with their enemies would break the spiritual connections that held Cronin's civilization together and would be a betrayal of everyone who had sacrificed their lives to protect their society from Zephyrian aggression. Both alien leaders pointed out that Jake's plan would require their civilizations to abandon fundamental aspects of their identities and ways of thinking that had developed over thousands of years of cultural evolution. They argued that humans could not understand the depth of commitment required to maintain the kind of perfect memories and emotional connections that define both Zephyrian honor culture and Cronin collective consciousness. Jake listened to their objections and acknowledged that his proposal was asking both species to do something that seemed impossible from their current perspectives. However, he argued that continuing the war was actually the easier choice because it allowed both civilizations to avoid the difficult work of examining their own beliefs and finding new ways to think about their place in the galaxy. Dr. Park supported Jake's arguments by presenting historical data that showed how long-lived species often became trapped in unchanging patterns of behavior, while shorter-lived species like humans were forced to adapt and evolve more quickly in response to changing circumstances. She suggested that perhaps humanity's brief lifespans gave them a different kind of wisdom that could help ancient civilizations break free from cycles of violence and hatred that had become self-perpetuating over the centuries. The fragile progress that Jake had made during weeks of careful negotiations was suddenly threatened when hardline military leaders from both empires arrived at the neutral station with enough firepower to destroy the diplomatic facility and everyone aboard it. War leader Termin Vexus of the Zephyrian Empire and battle coordinator Skex Corvid of the Cronin Federation had come to stop what they saw as a betrayal of everything their civilizations had fought for over the past 1,000 years. Vexus was older and more traditional than High Commander Osix, and he represented a faction within Zephyrian society that believed any compromise with the Cronins would dishonor their ancestors and weaken their empire for future generations. The war leader arrived with a battle fleet that included some of the most advanced warships in Zephyrian space, and he made it clear that he was prepared to use military force to prevent his own delegates from signing any agreement that might end the war. Battle Coordinator Corvid spoke for the most militant elements of Cronin society, and his collective consciousness included the memories and emotions of every Cronin who had died fighting the Zephyrians over the centuries. Corvid's faction believed that peace negotiations were a trap designed to weaken Cronin defenses and make their civilization vulnerable to a final devastating attack that would destroy their species completely. The situation became even more dangerous when news arrived that a rogue Cronin attack ship had destroyed a Zephyrian medical vessel in a nearby star system, killing hundreds of wounded soldiers and medical personnel who had been trying to evacuate civilians from a contested planet. High Commander Osix immediately prepared to leave the negotiations and return to Zephyrian space to coordinate military retaliation for what his people saw as an unprovoked attack on non-combatants. Jake realized that everything he had worked for during the past month was about to collapse, and that the failure of these negotiations would probably make future peace efforts impossible, because both sides would use the breakdown as proof that their enemies could not be trusted. The human diplomat knew he had to do something desperate and risky to prevent the return to full-scale warfare, but he was not sure what arguments could possibly convince beings who had been fighting for longer than human civilization had existed. In a moment of inspiration that surprised even his own team, Jake decided to challenge both species on their most fundamental beliefs about courage and honor and strength. He called for an emergency session with all delegates present, including the hardline military leaders who had come to stop the peace process, and he began to speak about what he had learned during his time studying the long war between the Zephyrians and Cronans. Jake told the assembled aliens that he had initially been impressed by their dedication and commitment to fighting for their beliefs across so many centuries, but that the more he learned about their conflict, the more he began to question whether continuing the war actually demonstrated the courage and strength that both species claimed to value above all other virtues. The human diplomat argued that maintaining a 1,000-year-old hatred was actually the easy choice, because it allowed both civilizations to avoid the much more difficult challenge of examining their own beliefs and finding new ways to think about their enemies. He spoke about human soldiers who had chosen to spare enemies who had surrendered, and leaders who had risked their careers and reputations to pursue peace negotiations with former adversaries, and ordinary people who had found the courage to forgive those who had hurt them and their families. Jake explained that in human experience, true strength was not measured by the ability to wage war, but by the willingness to risk the vulnerability that was required for peace. The human diplomat's words created an uncomfortable silence in the negotiation chamber, because he was essentially calling both species cowards for choosing to continue a familiar war rather than risk the unknown dangers and opportunities that might come with peace. Jake knew that his challenge might end the negotiations immediately, and could even result in his own death if the military leaders decided that he had insulted them beyond forgiveness. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when Junior Officer Costa Hinix of the Zephyrian delegation stood up and spoke publicly for the first time during the negotiations. The young Zephyrian admitted that she was tired of living in her grandfather's war, and that she wanted to build something new for her own generation, rather than spending her entire long life fighting battles that had started before she was born. Engineer Thix Bellman of the Cronin delegation supported Hinix's statement and acknowledged that the collective memory of constant conflict had made his people sick with hatred, and that perhaps it was time to create new memories based on cooperation and growth rather than destruction and revenge. Other younger members of both delegations began to speak up and express similar feelings about the war and their desire for a different kind of future. War leader Vexus and battle coordinator Corvette responded with anger and threats, but Jake noticed that some of their own junior officers were listening carefully to the younger delegates and seemed to be questioning their orders to prevent any peace agreement. The human diplomat realized that generational change might be the key to ending the conflict, even if the older leadership could not accept his proposals. The final vote took place while military fleets from both empires maintained defensive positions around the neutral station, and Jake knew that the wrong decision could trigger a battle that would destroy not only the peace negotiations, but also any hope of ending the 1,000-year war in the foreseeable future. The coalition of younger officers and war-weary veterans that had formed around Costa Hinix and Thix Bellman managed to secure enough support to approve Jake's unprecedented plan by the narrowest possible margin, despite fierce opposition from the traditional military leadership of both species. Jake made a decision that surprised everyone, including his own crew, when he volunteered to remain at the neutral station and personally oversee the implementation of the first phase of his peace plan, even though he knew that his short human lifespan meant he would never live to see the final success of the project he had designed. The human diplomat understood that both alien species needed to see his personal commitment to the long-term process and that his presence might help prevent the kind of misunderstandings and conflicts that could destroy the fragile agreement before he had a chance to prove itself. Dr. Park and the rest of Jake's team established the Mediation Institute in a section of the neutral station that had been abandoned for decades and began the difficult work of training diplomats from multiple species in the techniques of long-term conflict resolution that humans had developed through centuries of ending their own wars and building lasting peace between former enemies. The Institute became a center for studying how different species thought about conflict and cooperation and developed new approaches to negotiation that took into account the varying lifespans and cultural perspectives of the galaxy's many civilizations. The first ceasefire zones were established in star systems, where both empires had spent so many resources fighting over barren worlds that continuing the battles had become economically impossible for either side to sustain. These regions became testing grounds for Jake's theories about gradual cooperation and provided safe areas where humanitarian organizations could begin the work of helping civilian populations that had been trapped in war zones for generations. 10 years after the initial agreement was signed, the first joint colony was founded on a previously contested world that both species had fought over for centuries, without either side being able to establish permanent control. Zephyrian and Cronin refugees worked together to build new settlements, and their children grew up speaking each other's languages and learning to see their former enemies as neighbors and friends rather than threats to be destroyed. Jake celebrated his 60th birthday by reading reports about the first marriage between a Zephyrian artist and a Cronin engineer who had met while working on a terraforming project in one of the joint colonies. The human diplomat knew that this single wedding represented more progress toward lasting peace than had been achieved in the previous 1,000 years of warfare, and he felt pride in knowing that his species had contributed something valuable to the galaxy despite being newcomers to interstellar civilization. 50 years after Jake's original negotiations, both empires had begun the difficult process of transforming their military-industrial complexes into exploration and terraforming operations that could provide meaningful work for generations of soldiers and engineers who had been trained for war but now needed to learn how to build and create rather than destroy. The war generation was gradually being replaced by leaders who saw cooperation between former enemies as normal and natural rather than revolutionary and dangerous. The memorial service for Jake Morrison took place 150 years after he had first arrived at the neutral station, and representatives from dozens of species attended the ceremony to honor the human diplomat who had shown them that even the longest and most bitter conflicts could be ended through patience and understanding and the willingness to think about problems in new ways. High Commander Ossix's great-granddaughter spoke about how the human had taught her people that true courage meant choosing to build rather than destroy. Engineer Bellman's Hive descendants described how Jake's memory protocol had allowed the Cronin collective consciousness to transform their painful memories of war into wisdom about the importance of peace and cooperation. The former enemies had learned to honor their fallen comrades not through continued violence, but through the construction of a better galaxy, where future generations would never have to experience the suffering that had defined their civilizations for so many centuries. The final reports from the region that had once been the bloodiest battleground in the galaxy showed that Jake's impossible peace plan had succeeded beyond even his most optimistic expectations. The 1,000-year war had ended not with conquest or surrender, but with a new generation of leaders who chose to work together to solve the challenges facing their civilizations rather than fighting over the mistakes and grievances of their ancestors. The Mediation Institute that Jake had founded continued to train diplomats from across the galaxy in the human approach to conflict resolution, and his techniques were being used to end wars and prevent conflicts on hundreds of worlds. Humanity's gift to the universe had not been superior technology or military power, but the simple wisdom that enemies could become friends if they were given enough time and the right framework for change.